In this last episode of our series, Flora and Faith, we're going to look at a tree that helps us to navigate better seasons of adversity in our lives. Flora and Faith, Part 6. Let's go. In our last episode, Brad talked about a tree that very few people know about, the Atad tree. And we're going to talk about a similar tree that doesn't show up too many places in the scriptures. It's called the Rotem, or the broom tree. And it shows up in just a handful of places, but where it does show up, it packs a huge punch. So probably the best way to get into this tree is to just start with a question. When was the last time you experienced whiplash of the soul? Like things were going great and then bam, something happens and you find yourself in a place of just urgency. Because that is exactly where we find the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18 and chapter 19. I want to start just by reading in chapter 18, verse 46, what Elijah is experiencing. And it's important to know that in 1 Kings 18, Elijah is coming off of this massive victory over the prophets of Baal when we read these words, "But the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. He girded up his loins and he ran in front of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel." Now, I don't know what goes through your mind, but what goes through my mind when I read this story is that Elijah is victorious. The hand of God is on him. I mean, he is feeling it. He's on fire. I mean, he outruns a chariot, for crying out loud. That dude is feeling it right now. And then he gets to Jezreel and Jezebel gets involved. And that's when we read these words. "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life, Elijah, like the life of one of them, the prophets of Baal that you killed, by this time tomorrow." And notice Elijah's response. Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. And just like that, in the span of a few verses, Elijah swings from confidence to crisis, and we all find ourselves in those moments. Now, what I find really interesting about this passage that a lot of us will probably just read right over is mention of Beersheba. Now, if we were to look on a map at the ancient Israel, you're going to see that Beersheba is all the way here in the south. It's actually in a region known as the biblical Negev, part of the Negev desert, and it's one of the few east-west corridors through this kind of hillish country area in the land of Israel. And what is so unique about the biblical Negev is we've looked at this passage already before in this series from 1 Kings 4:25 that said, during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, all under their vines and their fig trees. Remember, we talked about that as this idiom for the good life, for shalom, for prosperity, for security. But there's this other idiom here from Dan to Beersheba. And if we look back at the map, Dan is all the way up in northern Israel, the northernmost part of ancient Israel. And Beersheba, which is in the biblical Negev, is the last habitable region in southern Israel. So to say from Dan to Beersheba is to say from all the way in the north to all the way in the south. So what we are meant to understand when Elijah responds to Jezebel by fleeing to Beersheba, it's like he runs to the border. It would be like saying, I showed up in Juarez. Like I am headed for the border. I am getting out of Dodge. I'm out of here. And that's where we find Elijah. And this is where Elijah has his encounter with the Rotem. So let's read in 1 Kings 19, verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree, or Rotem in Hebrew. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Now, this is a picture of a Rotem, and if it looks less like a tree and more like a bush to you, then you, my friends, are reading it right. This is a desert shrub. And a lot of times these are going to grow in dried out riverbeds or old wadis in the desert, and you might see a couple of them here or there, but in the springtime they bloom and they give off these beautiful white fragrant flowers. So you'll be in the desert and it's just like this explosion of color, and you can actually hear the bees as they're buzzing on these flowers and pollinating them. So it's very, very beautiful. But what you've got to keep in mind as it relates to this shrub, the Rotem, is that it is primarily a feature of the desert. This is a wilderness shrub. And there are four key aspects to the Rotem. And I just kind of want to walk you through these key aspects. And the first is just its shade. Now, if this picture seems ridiculous to you, then you, my friends, have not spent enough time in the wilderness. Now, I was in the biblical Negev about 2 weeks ago with a group, and it was 105 degrees. It will blow your mind how quickly all of your spidey senses tune themselves into where is the nearest shade. Even if it's 6 inches, you will find humans, animals, all life that wants to live a good life, finding and cramming itself into this shade. And so in a landscape like this, a desert wilderness, the shade of the Rotem is some of the only shade that you are going to find. And so that shade is just a lifeline in a desert landscape. But also you can see here that its branches are really wispy. It's like if there is a breeze, which sometimes there is in the desert, it blows right through that tree. And so the tree doesn't obstruct the breeze. And actually the way it's shaped, it tends to be a little wider at the top, open at the bottom, so you can sit under it and get the shade, but you'll also get that breeze as it blows through the tree. And that is just a delight if you are in a wilderness landscape. Another element to this tree is its coals or its embers. In fact, if you look into the Jerusalem Talmud, you find a line like this: one may assume with regard to all other embers that once they're extinguished on the outside, the same is true on the inside. But Rotem embers, though they are extinguished on the outside, still are not extinguished on the inside. So there was something about the coals that come from the Rotem. They burn faster, they burn hotter, and they burn longer than anything else. And this actually helps explain one of the other places that we see the Rotem show up in the Hebrew scriptures, which is in Psalm 120, verse 4. And it's a context that's talking about a deceitful tongue, somebody who's using their tongue to cause pain and harm. And the text reads, "A warrior's sharp arrows with the glowing coals of the broom tree," or the Rotem. Well, why would it be important to specify that? We understand that a sharp arrow hurts. Why the mention of the broom tree? Because those embers are so hot. They don't extinguish easily. It's like they burn forever. And the psalmist is saying that's what hurtful words, deceitful words are like. They just keep burning. So you've got the shade, you've got the breeze, you've got these glowing embers, and then there's one other just really fascinating and kind of bizarre element to this tree, and that has to do with its branches. So in the desert at night, it gets very cold, and you could feel exposed. You could die of hypothermia. And so what many people have learned about these branches is that you can cut them off, you can light them on fire and make coals, dig a little patch in the sand, put the coals, and then cover that patch of ground with sand, with like 4 to 5 inches of sand. And then you can actually sleep on it like a mattress that will keep you warm all night long. And so you just look at this bush and you think to yourself, gosh, that is not much to look at. That is not really extravagant. But friends, when you are in a wilderness environment, when you are in a context of crisis and extremity, this little goes a long way. I experienced this back in 2017 when Hurricane Irma came through Central Florida, and my family and I were without power for more than 8 days. And because I am a procrastinator, I was one of the last people to make it to the hardware store, and I actually bought the very last generator that was available in the store near our house, and it was called the Tailgater, and it only put out about 700 watts. And obviously this is used more for college football than for getting through hurricanes, but hey, we made do with what we had. It had enough power to light a coffee maker in the morning, a lamp at night, and then after the lamp was off, if I kept getting up every 2 hours, enough power to fuel 2 box fans to get us through the night. And you look at this thing and you say, man, it is not much. But friends, I am telling you that for 8 days in the summer of 2017, our universe orbited around this little thing. It sustained us and kept us going in a moment of crisis, and it filled us with such gratitude. That is a rotem. And Elijah couldn't be in a more dire circumstance. I mean, we looked at just a second ago that he comes to the wilderness and he sits down and he prays to God, take away my life. Now, what we're going to find out if you read through 1 Kings 19, God is going to have this interaction with Elijah, and Elijah is going to say to God, God, I'm the only one left who hasn't bowed his knee to the Baals. And God is going to say to him, Elijah, no, you're not. There are thousands of others who haven't. And so I'm just waiting for God to see Elijah here in the desert, praying for his life to be taken away, and for God to say, stop being such a martyr. Pull yourself up, get back out there. You're not the only one. And that's not what God does. What God does is he has him lie down under the broom tree, and then he wakes him up, and instead of scolding him, he serves him breakfast. He says, Elijah, get up and eat. It's like in his moment of crisis, God sees him and says, I know that this is hard for you. I want to give you what you need. And here's what's cool. This is not the first time that this has happened under the Rotem. Because if you look back into Genesis chapter 21, there is a story with a woman by the name of Hagar. Hagar was the Egyptian servant of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And if you remember, Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham because she's childless. Hagar conceives and gives birth to this son, Ishmael. Well, later in the story, Sarah becomes pregnant, and now there's this animosity between Hagar and Sarah, and Abraham is so distressed by it that he sends Hagar and the boy away. And Hagar goes out and wanders in the wilderness. And the text says this, when the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes in the wilderness. Now, if you read in the Talmud, Rabbi Meir says that one of the bushes was the Rotem. And so once again, we see somebody in a desert environment who's come to the end of themselves. They're all out of hope. She casts this baby under a rotem, and she can't bear to watch her child die. And so she walks a little further away. And the text tells us that she sits down opposite the baby, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Don't let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and she wept. Well, what do you expect is going to happen under this rotem? The same place where God met Elijah. Yeah, God hears. God sees the hard place that she's in, and God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. So what you've got to understand about the rotem is that it is a desert tree. It is a desert shrub. And the rotem, in essence, says to us that wilderness is the place where you come to the end of yourself. And then at the end of yourself, you discover God waiting there to meet you with open arms. In so many ways, the wilderness are those places of crisis and extremity that just bring us to the end of ourselves. We've got nothing left within to give, and we have to throw ourselves on the mercy of God. It's those places and experiences where we're most aware, as Frederick Buechner says, of our own smallness and most open to God's bigness. Because it's in the desert where God strips away all the distractions and all our inner resistance to the grace that he's just trying to give us. And when we come to the end of ourselves, God provides a rotem. It's this small grace that's actually huge. And so in a sense, the wilderness is less a place on a map and more a territory of the soul. Think about the person journeying through divorce, who's experiencing that painful pulling apart of two lives that have been joined together. And they come to the end of themselves. God, I can't do this anymore. Or joblessness, the person who's just sending out resume after resume, rejection letter after rejection letter, and just wondering, when are things going to change? Infertility, like we see in the story of Abraham. God, how many times are you going to let us not conceive, not bear a child? I mean, the wilderness is just the place of heartache and hopelessness where we come to the end of ourselves, and God provides some kind of small grace. He meets us and he invites us to become the kind of people who are resting under the rotem, where we find his miraculous provision, these small graces that are actually huge, that launch us back into the land of the living. We see it in Elijah, we see it in Hagar, and my guess is that you have seen this again and again in your life. And so the question I just want to leave you with is, can you look back through your life and recognize the rotems? Can you spot those places in a season of extremity and adversity where God met you and provided small grace that was actually huge? And what would it look like for you and I to become the kind of people who go out into a hurting world and to become the rotems in other people's lives? The arrival of God's gracious presence and provision in their wilderness experience. What would it look like for you to become the rotem that somebody else finds rest under? Well, friends, there you have it. That is the rotem, the broom tree. It's small. It doesn't show up everywhere in the text. It doesn't show up too often in the text, but where it does, it packs a punch. And my hope is that you will be inspired and energized by this, and that you will walk out this text well in your life.